We could all agree that the best way to establish the prophethood of a claimant, it is through prophecies that he makes. If they are detailed, they're not vague, and they are explicitly identified to be uttered before the event is allegedly taken place, we could confirm that this claimant is a true prophet.
Detailed, not vague, and clearly said before the event. Honestly, I have never seen that in Islam or Christianity. What I usually see is the exact opposite. The detailed prophecies magically appear after the event, and the ones that come before are so vague they could fit almost anything, as long as you're willing to do some emergency repairs, reinterpretations, rewrites, and a few Olympic-level historical gymnastics moves. This is the kind of prophecy that only works if you already know the ending. If your religion has those, then it's probably man-made. And keep this in mind, because we're about to look at a prophecy that comes with footnotes, commentaries, and explanations longer than the prophecy itself.
For example, in Deuteronomy 18, the people ask, how do we know who's a true prophet or a false prophet? God responds, if he says a prophecy in the name of the Lord, and that prophecy does not come to pass, he's a false prophet. But if it does come to pass, then he's a true prophet.
Unless the prophecy is vague, symbolic, or open to reinterpretation, it can never actually be wrong or proven true. And that's exactly why there were so many alleged prophets running around for centuries. When failure is impossible, confidence is cheap. Also, a single correct prediction proves almost nothing. A broken clock is right twice a day. What matters is frequency, precision, and failure rate. We all know the playbook. Step 1, make hundreds of vague statements about the future, like a ruler will fall or a city will tremble. Step 2, wait for something, anything, to sorta resemble one of them. Step 3, have your followers, centuries later, perform interpretive backflips and declare it a detailed, explicit prophecy. So if we're serious, here's a better test for a true prophet. A true prophet shall not speak one prophecy in his life, but many, and they shall be specific, dated, and falsifiable. And his hit rate shall be 100%, not 10%, not sometimes right if you squint. 100. If he predicts 10 things and 9 come true but 1 fails, he is not a mostly true prophet. He is a false prophet. That 10th miss isn't an oops, it's a deal breaker. Also, no fair saying God changed his mind after the fact. That's just the dog ate my prophecy excuse. What this means is that proof of prophethood requires a spreadsheet, not a 7-minute video talking about one single prophecy. It requires listing all the prophecies, the hits, the misses, the maybe if we reinterpret this word, and doing the math. We already have fortune tellers today get specific details right sometimes. It sounds impressive, until you realize they're making predictions by the hour.
A common mistake that Muslims make when presenting prophecies from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is that unfortunately they assume the Sunni Hadith corpus. Now, the Sunni Hadith corpus, in my opinion, is the best methodology in authenticating reports. However, when speaking with skeptics, they are not going to grant you that. And this is going to be a problem in continuing the conversation. The best way to establish the prophet is a true prophet is to use their methodology and establish that he actually uttered this prophecy before its fulfillment. If we appeal to oral transmission using a methodology they don't accept, then the conversation can't progress and proceed forward.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the rare moment of self-awareness. Skeptics are not going to just grant you the Sunni Hadith corpus and saying, trust me, our 8th century scholars had a flawless grading system for 7th century gossip, is a tough sell to anyone who doesn't already believe the conclusion. Playing the Hadith science is perfect card is the ultimate conversation ender. It's basically saying, the prophecy is true because the book that says the prophecy is true says it's true. And honestly, thank you for admitting that, because with that one concession, you just made roughly 99% of Islamic prophethood claims on social media evaporate like a mirage in the desert. Turns out you can't prove prophethood using sources your conversation partner doesn't accept. Who knew logic could be so inconvenient?
What if I told you there is a prophecy attributed to the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, historically attested, corroborated, that not a single skeptic on the face of the planet can object to? In Sunan Abi Dawud, there is a prophecy that is so detailed on so many different layers that you can't possibly have made it up. You can't possibly have looked around you, seen external factors based on the environment around you, based on the conditions around you. You couldn't have possibly made an educated guess about. There wasn't any hint to make this prophecy. It is super intriguing.
Not a single skeptic on the face of the planet can object to it? Wow, that sounds statistically miraculous. I mean, we've got skeptics who will object to gravity or water being wet if you give them enough time. But sure, this one is apparently the airtight exception. But don't get too comfortable. As we'll see, that confidence has a funny habit of quietly shrinking the moment a small challenge, or even one inconvenient question, shows up. In fact, he later admits that his own scholars were confused about it, that the wording was misinterpreted, and that the Prophet himself gave only a general description when it comes to the most important detail of the prophecy.
The Messenger of Allah ﷺ says, and I'm paraphrasing of course, he says, in the end times the Muslims will descend to a low-lying ground they will call Al-Basra. It will be beside a river called the Tigris River, above which will be a bridge. And descendants of Keturah with broad faces and small eyes will come, they will descend, and they will attack the Muslims. Now, he also mentions in this hadith that the city will be a capital city of the Muslims and its inhabitants will be numerous. And these Asian people, he describes them as broad faces and small eyes, they will come and they will attack this city. The inhabitants will split into 3 groups, and these 3 groups all perish except for some who disbelieve, as the word there is kafaru, which means perish or disbelieve. The point is the Muslims will lose, and it will be a very sad time for the Muslims.
All right, the claim goes like this. Muhammad said that people from the east, described as having broad faces and small eyes, would come through a place called Basra, defeat the Muslims, and cause a great calamity. Fast forward a few centuries, the Mongols show up, defeat the Abbasid state near something called the Gate of Basra, and therefore, Muhammad nailed both the location and the enemy's description. Except, he absolutely did not. Let's start with the elephant in the room that the Orthodox Muslim ignored. When did Muhammad say this would happen? There is no time frame, no date, no century, no generation, which means any Asian group defeating Muslims near that region at any point in history can be retroactively labeled a fulfillment. Give a prophecy unlimited time, and eventually something will stumble into it by sheer historical accident. This breaks the rule from our secret and improved prophet test. The prophecy shall be dated. You'd think the messenger of the all-knowing God could afford to add at least one risky detail like when, which brings us to the next glaring issue, at the end of time. 5 or 6 centuries later is not the end of time. It's not even halftime.
Hey, Orthodox Muslim, look, it says end times, but guess what? This is an inconsistent detail. So it's not included and it's not considered. But even if, let's grant it, even if it says at the end times, let's just correct it here quickly. Even if the hadith does consistently say at the end times, we have no problem with that, as the Prophet and the early community didn't have eminent apocalyptic views, meaning they didn't think that the end times were about to happen right away. As a matter of fact, the death of the Prophet, it comes in narration, is the first sign of the end times. So technically we've been at the end times since the Prophet died.
Really? We've been at the end of time since 14 centuries ago? After the rise and fall of empires, industrialization, electricity, the internet, space travel? Then you're telling us the end of time is meaningless. You could delete at the end of time from the hadith and nothing changes. So why is it even there? Did the all-knowing prophet just enjoy adding dramatic, vacuous filler? Now, when Muhammad says things like, "I in the last hour have been sent like this," and gestures with his fingers, defenders suddenly want to claim it's poetic, that it's just a lesson about life being short, mortality, and all that existential stuff. Fine, but in the context of this hadith, end of time isn't poetic. It's supposed to signal nearness to the real end times events. Jesus returning, cosmic signs, final judgment. A Mongol invasion in the 13th century? That's not close. And calling it an inconsistent detail? It's in the hadith you showed my friend. I'm sorry, but since I can literally read at the end of time in your hadith, this prophecy's clock hasn't even started yet. Maybe the Chinese will invade Basra after the United States falls. Who knows?
We know that this prophecy, at the very least, existed few hundred years before the event takes place and before the fulfillment happens. We don't even need to look at the isnad.
Yes, there is a hadith recorded before the Mongol invasion. And honestly, who cares if the chain is a little shaky? If the prophecy actually described the event in clear, specific detail, not vague, generic statements, then that would be genuinely impressive and demand an explanation. So let's skip the tedious Sanad debates and go straight to the content. That's where the real test is.
This prophecy is already in existence, in circulation in the first century. And it has and finds its fulfillment 500 to 600 years later at the Siege of Baghdad. The Siege of Baghdad marks the end of the Islamic Golden Age when the Mongols, who are an Asian people with broad faces and small eyes, they descend, they attack the Muslims in a city called Baghdad. They attack this city in the area called Babul Basra. The city was huge and it was known by different bureaus.
First off, broad faces and small eyes. This doesn't uniquely identify Mongols. It loosely describes millions of people across Central Asia, Siberia, and East Asia. If you want detailed, you give a country name, a tribe, a banner, a leader's name. But no, we get a physical description that could fit any number of groups once you already know the outcome. This is exactly why early Muslim scholars suggested that the prophecy was referring to the Turks, not the Mongols. Because when your broad faces and small eyes description is so vague it could fit half of Asia, or even parts of Europe, you need to pick someone, anyone, that makes sense historically.
It is not surprising that when the early Muslims read this narration describing a people with broad faces and small eyes, and they had interacted with an Asiatic people that did have a broad face and small eyes like the Turks, it is not hard to assume that naturally they'd connect the dots together and identify the people from this hadith with the Turks. But that doesn't mean that the Prophet intended the Turks in mind. It just means that Muslims applied this description to something that fit the description in their mind. Also, this is not far-fetched because we have other hadith where the Prophet does give a similar prophecy that the Muslims will fight the Turks who are broad faces and small eyes. So just because they conflated these descriptions with one another and they speculated that this is the Turks, it doesn't mean that it's the Turks. Why? Because we have the perfect later fulfillment with the Mongols who did have broad faces and small eyes. And because there's a perfect fulfillment, therefore it goes back to the Prophet.
So basically the proof that this prophecy isn't about the Turks is that another group also fits the same vague description, and their invasion happened later. Let me translate that into a parable. You predict a man with a beard will betray you. Your friend Bob, who has a beard, betrays you. Decades later, your friend Frank, who has an even bigger beard, betrays you even worse. And you declare that the prophecy was really about Frank all along. Bob was just a practice betrayal. So it's the Turks, until someone with slightly smaller eyes comes along. Then it's the Mongols. And in the future, if some people with even smaller eyes attack, well, it's no longer the Mongols. You now have an infinitely retroactive prophecy. Good luck falsifying that. What you conveniently ignored is why early Muslims thought it was the Turks in the first place. That can only happen if they were lying to themselves, or more likely, the hadith is vague as hell in describing the people. In the end, the problem isn't with the scholars who had to make sense of a cloudy prophecy. It's with the Prophet who couldn't be bothered to give a clear one. You said it yourself.
The Prophet doesn't specify, rather he gives a general description of an Asiatic population.
Secondly,
they attack this city in the area called Babul Basra.
Basra is one city, Baghdad is another. The hadith mentions Basra. If it really meant Baghdad, you'd expect it to say something like a gate in Baghdad, or a city north of Basra, or even a great city between two rivers, which is also a future capital built after me. So why name a specific existing city hundreds of miles south? The convenient answer is, because Baghdad didn't exist when this prophecy was first circulated, but Basra did. This suggests the prophecy was crafted with contemporary geography in mind, not future revelation. Muslims know Basra as a low-lying area. Baghdad? Not so much, it's on higher ground. So when the hadith says low-lying ground called Basra, it's probably just talking about Basra itself, not some vague nearby location. Sure, Baghdad had a gate called Bab al-Basra because roads and trade routes were often named after their destinations, but that doesn't magically make the entire city of Baghdad into Basra. By that logic, any city with a gate of Damascus would become Damascus itself. Geography doesn't work that way. The hadith also describes this Basra as a place with numerous people and one of the capital cities of immigrants. The Gate of Basra? Hardly. That's more of a neighborhood, or at best a small town, not one of the main cities or capitals. Now you might ask, why all the fuss about Baghdad anyway? Basra was important too, right? Well, the Mongols didn't care much about Basra. Their real target was Baghdad, and Basra only came under their control after Baghdad fell. So even if you try to stretch the hadith, the historical facts make that shift extremely hard to justify.
The hadith says Al-Basra, not Baghdad. Therefore, the Prophet couldn't have been speaking about the sack of Baghdad. This is also wrong, and it's a wrong assumption. Now, I do agree that people who read this hadith, who knew it, where it was circulating, people would naturally assume the Prophet speaking about the city called Al-Basra, and therefore identify Al-Basra in the hadith with the city called Al-Basra. Again, that's not a problem. The point is, there is a perfect fulfillment that finds place in Baghdad. And in Baghdad, there's a huge borough. For instance, take this as an example. Imagine I was a self-proclaimed prophet and I made the following prophecy. In Vancouver, on this day, in this month, on that year, this will take place, and this will happen, and that will happen. And on that day, in that year, in that month, exactly what I said happened. But it didn't happen in Vancouver, Canada. It happened in Vancouver, Washington, which is a small town. Nobody knows it. When you say Vancouver, usually people would assume you're talking about the big city Vancouver, the Vancouver in Canada. But because this fulfillment does take place in its detail and it's historically fulfilled, we could assume that the intent of the author of the prophecy, of the speaker of the prophecy, was Vancouver, Washington, after all, and not Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. Therefore, because there's a perfect fulfillment in Babul Basra, in Baghdad, we could assume the inference to the best possible explanation that the Prophet had really intended Baghdad, Babul Basra specifically, and not the city Al-Basra.
The only details we actually have here are when, who, and where, and those are the ones failing. So far we've got the when, at the end of time, and you've already said that it doesn't actually mean what it obviously says. The who, people with broad faces and small eyes. No wonder why your scholars have confused them with the Turks. The where is a place called Basra, but now we're being told it has to be Baghdad because the perfect fulfillment demands it. That's it. There are no other compelling details. No leader's name, no date, no specific tribe, no unique weapon, no political cause. Your Vancouver analogy isn't just irrelevant, it's an unintentional confession. If a divine messenger's prophecy is so ambiguous that it can be fulfilled by an event in a small town most people have never heard of, rather than the major global city he named, then his prophetic clarity is a joke. And let's address the final stretch, the claim that the Mongols attacked through the Al-Basra Gate. The Mongol army surrounded and besieged Baghdad from all sides. They didn't stage a polite single-file entry through a specific, famously named gate. The entire city was encircled and stormed.
The fulfillment happens exactly as the Prophet mentions, exactly as the different reports mention.
Yeah, that's enough for me. If anything, this prophecy pushed me even further away from Islam. We're done here. Goodbye.